Hi, I'm Stephen Downs.
And I'm Adam Risby.
And this is Letters to the Sky, a podcast about the metaphysical iconoclasts, philosophical visionaries, and religious leaders of the world.
Whether you consider yourself religious, spiritual, neither, or something in between, we invite you to take a deep dive with us down metaphysical rabbit holes and learn to see your life from a new perspective.
Hey, Adam.
Stephen, long time.
It's been so long. You know, someone told me the other day I have a podcast voice. Have you heard that yet from anybody?
Yeah, just now from you. And I agree.
You think I have a podcast voice?
I told you once before, actually earlier today, that I thought you have a very sultry voice.
That is not something I've ever thought about my own voice. I tend to think my voice is like super nasally.
I guess maybe.
And nasally and sultry don't really go together. I think of like if I like smoked a lot of cigarettes and was really into jazz. That's more of a sultry feeling.
That kind of sultry. There's a different kind of sultry. No, I could listen to you talk for a long time. I think that's what makes...
You do.
That is true. Yeah, that's correct. Touche, sir. Touche.
Anyway, I hadn't thought about that, but apparently I have a podcast voice. This is my podcast voice, everyone. All right.
Crickets.
Today... So today we are diving into Zen with Wild Ivy by Norman Waddell. Waddell? I'm sorry, Mr. Waddell, if I'm butchering your name right now. It's about a Zen master in the 17th century named Hakuin Ikaku. He's a Zen priest, and I think we spoke about this in one of the most recent episodes. He is one of the most famous Zen masters of recent memory, for sure, in Japan. And he is kind of single-handedly responsible for helping revive the Rinzai Zen school, which was kind of dying off at the time due to, a lot of different factors, which they go into in the book, but it's not necessarily important for his story. His story is not about Rinzai Zen. Wild Ivy is an autobiography. And he was an incredibly polarizing figure because he was incredibly independent and did not hesitate to speak his mind. And Adam, are you familiar with like when academia, like professors like burn each other in papers?
Yeah.
Like the abstract of a paper will just like completely like go scorched earth on someone else's paper, but like it's said in a way that like you only get it if you like know what they're talking about. I feel like Hakuin is the Zen version of that.
Yeah.
Well, I know he's a little more direct. He also like just says people are straight up idiots and...
Yeah, there's the line in there where he's pretty explicit.
Fair enough. All right.
Thieving monks. There's a line in there.
Anyway, so we're going to get into Hakuin and who he was and why he did what he did. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about what he was after and what his students were after and what is the point of it all, because no conversation between Adam and I complete without that discussion.
Yeah, and for those of you who think we are talking about some rando in the history of Zen Buddhism, have you ever heard of the famous line, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" I'm sure you've heard of that. And if you haven't, take the rock.
Is that it?
Yeah, that's the... for those of you who can't see Stephen, he just attempted what I just said. If you haven't heard of that, yeah, there's a rock above you. You can move it aside and come out into the light.
Wow.
Hakuin,
Adam, that is one of the deepest burns I've ever heard you say about some person you don't even know.
I mean it with the...
It's so sad.
Compassion.
It's such a gentle burn, and yet I'm impressed by it. I'm overall very disappointed in you.
I don't know how to feel about that. Hakuin is the one who came up with that, Master Hakuin, and there's an interesting story of why he did that, but we'll get to that. Stephen, tell us more. Just so you know, I'm staring at Stephen right now, and he's not doing anything.
All right, I can't do it for too long.
Yeah, that was hard. That was the definition of awkward silence. It just started to get comfortable towards the end.
I want to do it longer, but I don't want people to get mad at me.
Yeah.
Okay. So Hakuin. So I think right in the beginning of the introduction to this book, it says Hakuin's principal motive for relating his story was clearly instructional. He believed that by telling others about his experiences, he could encourage them in their training, and that in doing so, he could clarify his basic approach to Zen study and help students avoid falling victim to contemporary teachings that he felt were destroying the Rinzai school's time-honored tradition of koan study. So for those of you who maybe a little bit of a short amount of background, and I mean, neither Adam nor I are Zen practitioners, so my understanding about this is mostly theoretical, but there are two main current schools of Zen, Soto and Rinzai. And Soto, well, I won't even talk about Soto, but Rinzai is famous for koans. And a koan, like Adam said, is a question that has... Yeah, you have to noodle it. Like,
Terrible.
what is the sound of one hand clapping, right? Like that, you might think there's some like clever, smarmy answer to that, but like really consider it. And so a lot of the practice in koans is to take a koan and to really grapple with it over and over and over. And traditionally, students in monasteries would be assigned a koan by the master, and they would grapple with it, and they would go in for interviews several times a day with the master to try and tell the master their understanding, and the master would continuously send them back over and over and over, no, until finally they got it. And so there's a lot of focus in koan practice about like, it's almost like a pressure cooker. And I've always related this to Chan, like coming from Chan Buddhism. And in Chan, they talk about like fostering the great doubt, which I feel like is really related to like koan practice. I've always related it, and I've never really looked into why, if there's a link or not, but they talk about the great doubt, which is really going internal and just like dissolving oneself and what one thinks one knows.
And for those who don't know, though, a term that Stephen is using, there's actually a history, etymological history in the word Zen. Zen comes etymologically from the word Chan, which is based in China.
Yeah.
And then the word Chan itself actually comes from dhyan. Dhyan means to meditate upon in Sanskrit, or to put one's attention on. So really the most fundamental understanding of meditation in the Sanskrit vocabulary ends up becoming the word Zen when it gets to Japan.
Wow. I refuse to give you props for that. Okay, Adam, I've been talking a lot.
Yeah. Well, let's start with a little story that gives us a little bit of an insight into Hakuin as a character and as a personality, because really one of the things Steve and I was talking about before recording, which is that...
Stephen and I were talking about.
Yes, thank you for the correction. Hakuin revolutionized Zen, and he actually brought it back from the fires of extinction. And it takes a certain character to do that. It takes a certain force, a certain power. And I wanted to share one of the earlier stories as a child to give us a sense of who he was. So Hakuin, again, he was born, 1686, something like that. Yeah, 1686, died in 1768. In that time...
Oh, 18th century, okay.
His mother was a Buddhist, and specifically a Nichiren Buddhist. And there was a priest from the Nichiren school that actually came to visit some of the nearby temples, and he would go and with his mother and listen to this priest. In one particular account, this is when he was 11 years old, he talks about when he went to hear the famous Nichiren preacher describe in great detail the terrible punishments inflicted upon sinners who fell into one of the 8 hot hells. From that time on, he was tormented by the fear of having to face such a horrible retribution himself. And it was this fear, he said, that drove him to seek a means of escaping such a fate. That's the genesis of Hakuin's spiritual journey, according to all major texts, and his main disciple, Torei, who wrote his biography, said that's what started him on his path. He was afraid of being punished in the 8 hot hells. I mean, Christianity and Islam has 1 hell. Apparently, these Nichiren Buddhists had 8.
Oh yeah, man. And there's a lot of levels of hell in Buddhism. Yeah, and there's that fear of bad things happening. So in Buddhism, the fear of rebirth, the fear of unfortunate rebirths would be a major driving factor for a lot of people. I think, especially in endemic Buddhist countries, where they don't have to grapple with secular, whatever we want to call it, atheism, secular atheism. They're just conflicted. Okay, I won't get into that.
To continue the story, and I find it a really fascinating story. He cries to his mom, and he's like bawling, and his mom's like, all right, I promise you I will tell you tomorrow what you need to do to avoid escaping hell. And having slept poorly in the many days prior, out of his fear, he finally sleeps in peace, gets up the next day and asks his mom, and his mom kind of delays things, knowing there's not much she can tell him, and does his hair or something. And eventually he says, listen, stop delaying it. And that's the beginning of a doubt that his mother really knows what needs to be done. And she gives him I get the impression that she's sort of pacifying his fears. She says, oh, just worship the local deity. Oh gosh, I forget his name now. But he calls him Tenjin. So he gets up at 2 a.m. every morning and he prays to Tenjin to save him. And he has this interesting thing. It was like, if you are there, dear God, local deity, then make the smoke from the incense stick in front of me rise straight. If you're not there and you can't save me, he assumes that he's there, but if you can't save me, then may the smoke be chaotic. He opens his eyes, and sure enough, it's straight. He closes his eyes, and he's so grateful, and then he opens his eyes again, and it's chaotic and crazy. And he's like, damn, and I almost thought I could trust you. That secondary doubt, first it was his mom, and now it's like that he can't trust this deity that's supposed to be his savior of hell. And I think that's at age 11, that really did it for him, and he realized he needed to solve this himself.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is, it's really interesting because that kind of, maybe you could call it a realization that there's no one coming to help you, that there's no one responsible for your salvation is, other than you, is what you end up figuring out, is really foundational to Buddhism in general. And I think that it's really telling that he had that at 11 years old, came to that conclusion that, it ain't coming.
Yeah, I don't think I was anywhere near Hakuin at that age. I do remember, though...
Oh, really? Are you sure, Adam?
Pretty sure, but I was about to say something.
Well, I don't want you to. Okay, I do want you to.
I went, having been raised in part in the Islamic tradition, I was on the prayer mat, and I remember asking, I don't remember exactly what I said, but I remember asking, hey, God, if you're really there, make the lights flicker. Something to that effect. Of course, it didn't ever happen, but it is interesting how when I read this, I was like, oh yeah, I kind of did something similar when I was younger. Like,
yeah, for sure.
Your parents tell you that there's this great, powerful deity, and as a child, you kind of want proof of that. I think it's sort of a natural feeling, but it is something. It sort of awakens a desire to know what's really going on here. How do things really work behind the scenes?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. I remember having similar thoughts and questions as a kid.
So tell us a little bit of, okay, so now at some point Hakuin grows up and he starts to go to these different temples and having some experiences. What do you think is motivating him? Clearly he's heard about meditation leading to a great awakening, enlightenment, that if you do zazen, which is sitting practice, there's some realization that you'll get. He's motivated by something. At first it was the fear of going to hell, but it kind of evolves. Yeah. Work with me, Stephen. Work with me.
His motivation is his motivation. Like, I don't know. I guess I didn't gravitate towards that in the book, Adam. Is
Oh,
what I'm trying to
okay.
say.
Got it. It's interesting. I was very consumed by his, like, why he did what he did.
Yeah. I was more consumed by, I mean, I'd love if you have any good insults quoted for us.
Oh.
That's really what I care about.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Good insult comedy.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna look for. He had some nice insults. So I'll quickly sprint to him being a young man, and then eventually an adult. So he goes to this guy named Shoju Rojin. His first major.
Yeah, which is like his most important
Right.
teacher.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I figured out. His mom said, "You must always worship the deity of the Kitano Shrine," and then he called him Tenjin. Apparently, that was his name. Anyway, I forgot that. So he goes to this. He grows up and he realizes that okay, there are these priests that know about hell. They surely would know how to get out of that and how to avoid punishment. And over the course of going from temple to temple, he starts to realize that there are a group of practitioners of Zen at the time who he later calls do nothing Zen practitioners, which is the sense like, and he means it in a derogatory way. They just sit around and they say that they're meditating, but really they're literally just doing nothing, and they're not actually gaining any deeper awakening. And he vilified them. He ripped them to shreds.
Which is interesting because one of the descriptions of Zazen is doing nothing, right? Like you're not sitting there like attempting to do anything. Like that is the practice of Zazen. And it's funny that Hakuin like rips him a new one.
Yeah, I think that's why Hakuin likes koans, because with a koan you can ask a student or a practitioner, what's your insight into this koan? And what they say, how they respond, reveals their understanding. Whereas if everyone's just sitting around, you don't really know, unless you have some deeper mystical insight into what they're going through. You don't really know their degree of attainment or awakening.
I think as well, and he talks about this definitely, I mean, for sure during his later years after his great awakening, but he talks about, what is it? The do nothing Zenists, they really aren't serving anyone. Like they aren't working with compassion. They aren't, serving unenlightened beings. They're just sitting there doing nothing. And he was very much a fan of like active practice and active serving others. And so I think from my guess from the read is that was another big part of it for him, was he really like just didn't like people who didn't do anything. Instead it was, I'm meditating. He's like, there are countless beings out here who are suffering. Like, what are you doing for them?
Yeah, I got the quote.
Okay, I'm ready.
So this is in his biography. He says, there's like a whole paragraph where he talks about how they're do nothing Zenists and they don't even live up to their self-proclaimed role, passing day after day in a state of seated sleep. So good. And then he says, I have a verse that pours scorn on this odious race of pseudo-priests. That's like his preamble to a poem that he wrote to them. Here's the poem itself. Earth's vilest thing, from which all men recoil, crumbly charcoal, firewood that's wet, watered lamp oil, a cartman, a boatman, a stepmother, skunks, mosquitoes, lice, blue flies, rats, thieving monks. That's the poem. He's basically describing them. And then he goes to say, monks, priests, you can't all be thieves, every last one of you. And when I talk about thieving priests, I refer to those, quote, silent illumination Zenists who now infest the land.
Oh my God. So eventually, let's jump forward a little bit. So eventually he basically has these, he goes through different awakenings and different enlightenments, and then he decides to like kind of stay put, right?
Right.
Yeah. So he that's when he starts to really have followers. like a large following, is when he decides he returns to his childhood temple,
Right.
and he takes it over, and that's when he really starts to have a following, and people start seeking him out.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. What's interesting is at any given time, there were something like 10 to 20 monks practicing with him. He gets, after he kind of explores all the Buddhists and the nearby temples, he comes back to his home local temple and gets placed as the head abbot. He then has a small following, but it takes something like 10 years before it starts growing. But then when it does grow, he then goes to teach, and there's something like 500 people that show up. Now we're talking about like countryside Japan in the 1600s. This is a big deal. I think 500 people showing up is the equivalent of, I don't know, 20,000 people in an auditorium, right? It's like, and people traveling all over the world because they had horse-drawn carriages back there. So it was a big deal to come from northern Japan all the way down to where he was outside of Edo, which is now Tokyo. So was there something that you were going to add to that, Steve?
No, I wasn't. If you had more to say about this, but I wanted to jump into some of his more like internal kind of troubles. I don't know if you'd call it like his internal world.
Yeah, totally.
Okay, I'm good. You can. Okay, cool.
You have my.
So one of the things I like at one point, he's had these awakenings, and he says during the travels that followed his return to Shoinji, it became clear to Hakuin that his attainment was still incomplete. He had no doubts about the depth of his enlightenment. He was sure that his grasp of koans and Zen teachings was sharp and clear, yet he found it impossible to sustain the tranquility he experienced in the quietness of the Zen hall when he returned to the tumult of everyday life. And this I think is something I want to talk to you about. I feel like a physician who possesses a wonderful knowledge of medicine but has no effective means of curing an actual sickness, he lamented. How can I possibly hope to help rid other sentient beings of their afflictions as long as I still suffer from illness myself? With renewed determination, he now grasped the whip in hand and spurred the dead ox forward once again. The focus of his post-Satori training was directed henceforth to achieving the total integration of the two aspects of his life, the quiet and the active.
Wow, that's great. The quiet and the active, the two aspects of his life. Yeah.
Yeah.
So first of all, we gotta unpack some of this.
Yeah.
Post-Satori practice implies Satori.
Yeah.
What is Satori, and what is the importance of a post-Satori practice?
All right. So for those of our listeners who don't know what the word Satori means, Satori is, you could think about it in English as translated to a sudden awakening. And so one of the foundations of Zen and Chan practice is sudden awakening. And so this is where koans come in. And even in Zazen, it's like you're not doing anything particular that is like, oh, I am becoming enlightened, right? But then all of a sudden there's this pop from nowhere that puts you into an awakened state, right? And so in Zen, that's the Satori. And in Zen, they talk about large Satoris and small Satoris. And for those people who've been on the spiritual practice in any tradition, they'll certainly relate to those moments when they've like woken up. And maybe it wasn't complete. It wasn't, we talk about complete as in like irreversible enlightenment, but there's something, those are all Satoris. And so there's, when we talk about how does one practice, there is pre-Satori practice and then there's post-Satori practice. And so those are different. And I'm not an expert in the way Zen in general talks about pre and post Satori practice, but there's a difference, and there's a difference in a lot of different traditions, because the conversations you can have, the way a teacher can communicate with a student are very different once a student has had some level of sudden awakening.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about sudden versus gradual.
Yeah, so this is I know about it from the Tibetan tradition, and in certain schools of Buddhism, the idea is to gradually come to awakening. And that doesn't mean there aren't moments of awareness, but it's not like you're not putting yourself into a pressure cooker while all of a sudden you pop, right, into enlightenment. It's more like you are gradually, you're spending time cultivating merit. You're spending time, kind of doing a very holistic, gradual path to enlightenment, and sudden awakening is tends to be very intense. It happens kind of out of nowhere. And I mean, me personally, I've had, a teacher who's very much sudden awakening style, and then I've had teachers who are very much, gradual, and they both have their strengths and values. They're neither, one's not necessarily better than the other, but I don't know. Is that what you wanted me to say?
Whatever you say is what I want you to say.
Did I get an A?
A plus.
Yes.
When we were talking about Alan Watts way back when, several episodes ago, we talked about how enlightenment kind of is like an onion. And this is what Alan Watts talks about. And he says, like peeling away an onion, and there's no core, actually. You keep peeling, and eventually the layers are all gone, and what you're left with is nothing. So tell me a little bit about how that relates to enlightenment, because we're talking about enlightenment and sudden versus gradual awakening as if everyone understands what we are awakening to, right? And so there are listeners
absolutely.
who may not. Like, what does that mean? What do you?
Yeah. So I mean, this gets into. We're really going to start talking about non-duality. What is non-dualism, right? And I know we've talked about it before, but it's always a great topic to talk about. So we're going to talk about it again. So, I really think Hakuin's "What is the sound of one hand clapping" gets to it, right? It gets to it, and I'm not an expert in koans by any means, but I would just invite you, the listener, to just pause for a moment and pause the podcast if you can, and just think, just reflect. What is the sound of one hand clapping, right? And see that, hopefully you reflected on this, and hopefully your mind kind of did some cartwheels, and your mind kind of went for a minute and tried to figure things out, and then it kind of stopped. There was nothing left, and so I feel like that's the start of understanding the potential, the depth of non-duality. But I really feel, a lot of times people conflate Buddhism, and particularly a type of Buddhism called Madhyamaka, which it has its home in a lot of different types of Buddhism, even though it's more central to Tibetan Buddhism. But people conflate it with nihilism. The idea that there's nothing, you can't prove anything exists, but you also can't prove that nothing doesn't exist, and you can't prove they neither exist and exist. You can't actually make these metaphysical statements about anything beyond what you can see, but what you can your sensory experiences. And when you really sit with that, and you really sit with I can't actually say anything positive or negative about the world around me, other than it appears one way, and it might be useful that way. And you really dive into the fact that you can't tell anything about the world around you in a real, really, 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 you can't say for 100% certainty. No, I'm not talking about inner knowing. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about inner knowing. I'm talking about with your mind. You can never point to something and know 100% of things about it, right? You can't have absolute knowledge. That really gets for me is an entryway to non-dualism, and understanding that it's not one or the other. It's not what you think it is, and it's not what you think it is, right? Because you can say, for example, that this table in front of me, it's not really, I can't prove that it's actually there, that it's the table, but I also can't prove that it's not the table, right? And so what is it, right? So is it the table or is it not? Well, it's both, but it's also neither. But it's also not both, and it's not neither. You can't actually see, you can never get to that thing that it is. And if you start taking that practice on with the things around you in your life, you realize that there are no answers. And then you can go deeper and realize you were never born, and you could never die, because those imply something that is there, which you don't know, you can't know, right? And so it's not even that you're going beyond dualism. It's just the absence of it, right?
Yeah. So what you're pointing to...
That's my TED Talk. Thank you.
Audience is clapping.
No, they're not.
What I understand from what you just said is that there are constructs that seem real, and we operate our reality assuming that they're real. And one of the constructs is a table. Another construct is a mountain range, right, with clouds.
Yeah.
And another construct is the self. The idea
Yeah.
that Stephen is actually a thing. Like it's
Oh wow, I love where you're
It's a
going with this.
person.
Yeah, you're like me but focused. Yeah, it's good.
I'm the better version of you. Bam!
Isn't that
Zing!
just the case?
Kidding, just kidding. Yeah, so going back to this idea of construct, so you don't know that the table exists. You don't know that it doesn't exist, right? So the same thing. You start to work it backwards to the concept of yourself. So we talk about the idea of Stephen, the construct of Stephen, the construct of Adam, and I think one invitation is, okay, if you're listening to this, ask yourself, where is your sense of self? And if you're like the vast majority of people, just pause for a moment, your sense of self, me, the I-ness here, kind of feels like it's a point of awareness behind a pair of eyes in what's an area called the head. And you look down and there's a body there. It's such a tempting thing to want to say, this is me, right? This body or this point of awareness is me. And if you're able to go beyond that, maybe say, well, that's not quite me because I have a body, but I'm not a body. And you might think, well, it's my thoughts. That's an even more subtle layer to ask these questions of constructs. Is it real? Is it not real? In terms of your thoughts. And you can do that with your emotions. And you keep going into more and more subtle realms of the psyche. And what I would argue is, at a certain point in at least how in the Madhyamaka tradition or maybe other traditions, they might get you get to the point where you realize there's the inherent substancelessness of reality becomes.
Would you call it emptiness, Adam?
I would, but I purposely chose
I know.
substancelessness. I'll explain my thoughts in a moment, but like you get to this point where you realize, wow, there's nothing actually there. And it seems, as you said, nihilistic, but if you're actually in the experience of waking up to the nothingness, you realize it's totally full. And it's completely running over with a fullness of life and a presence of life. And that's, I think, a little bit into what people awaken into. And I know the word emptiness is often misconstrued in the Western world, again, within a nihilistic context. That's why I like the word substancelessness. It's a little bit hard to say.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to get back to the nihilism thing is, when you think about nothing matters, right? That's like nihilism, that there's nothing has to have any consequences, right? And just the fact that if nothing matters, then nothing matters that it doesn't matter, right? And so you're left with, I feel like you're kind of left at the same place. You kind of have to come back to the same place of there's this fullness, right? There's this, I don't even know how to, I feel like I'm just butchering it now. I feel like you did a much better job than I did. I was watching when I was explaining it and just watching your eyes glaze over and watching you like slowly start to cry.
Over.
Yeah, that's substance. I like the use of substanceless.
When we talked about Alan Watts way back when, you started the episode by saying, is enlightenment real? And interestingly, both you and I said no.
Yeah.
So,
oh man, are we going to go back to that again?
Well, this is like what Hakuin was doing this whole time.
Oh, sure. I'm ready. I'm just asking.
Like, I'm just curious. I think it's about time. We've done how many episodes now?
I think it is. Yeah, I think it is.
We actually didn't explain what we meant by that.
No, let's come full circle.
Yeah, so clearly Hakuin is striving for enlightenment. He has a glimpse into something with his teacher, Shoju Rojin. Shoju Rojin is his teacher for something like 8 months. He has a profound awakening, and he glimpses this emptiness of self, and he realizes that the nature around him is not separate from him. There's an inherent oneness to it, but it's just a glimpse, right? And he wants to anchor it, and he eventually has what's called his great enlightenment, or the grand enlightenment, at the age of 41, I believe.
Yep.
So when we say enlightenment, and Hakuin is striving for enlightenment and attains enlightenment, we're talking about something. But when we said enlightenment is not possible, we're referring to something when we say that.
Yeah, absolutely. Was that like you handing it over to me?
Yes, it was, Steven.
Any opportunity I have to like break your flow, I take.
Oh my God.
Yeah, so for a long time we're seeking enlightenment. We have this thing, it's like final release or whatever you want to call it. We have these little tastes of it. We have these moments of awakening, and then at some point it happens and we actually experience enlightenment, and we realize that just like the substancelessness, enlightenment itself is substanceless. So there is no enlightenment because enlightenment is just another concept, right? Like the concept of enlightenment is something that's useful for people who aren't enlightened. But as soon as you have had a substantial enlightenment experience, you realize that there is no enlightenment, because otherwise enlightenment would just be another thing that can be destroyed, that can end, that can begin, that is based in dualism, and enlightenment is not.
That's interesting. I actually didn't think you'd go there with...
Do you disagree?
I totally agree.
Is this a debate?
I totally agree, and I would offer another perspective, too.
No one wants to hear it. All right. Yeah, let's hear it. Let them hear your laugh, Adam. Let them hear your beautiful goat laugh. When Adam laughs, he sounds like a goat bleeding.
Oh my gosh. I have these images of YouTube memes coming in my head right now.
Of goats?
Of goats.
I can't tell you how many hours of goats I've watched on YouTube in my life.
They're better than cat memes, man.
No, the only thing that's better than goats is, and I'm a cat owner and a cat lover, is cats accidentally being startled, but in groups of them, because it's like a trigger effect where one cat gets startled and the rest of them just scatter for no reason, and they just okay, we can go back to enlightenment.
I feel like the goat bleeding is just so hilarious, and then they get their stiff legs and they fall over.
Well, the fainting goat's classic.
Oh my God, it's classic. What were we talking about? Jesus Christ.
You were going to offer another perspective on how enlightenment doesn't exist, and you were surprised, I guess, by what I said.
Oh, yeah. Pleasantly surprised. And it totally makes sense, because I think you and I talked about it before. But the idea was like, okay, enlightenment is not possible because who is getting enlightened?
Oh, you go that route.
I go that route.
Oh,
yeah.
Interesting.
So are you pleasantly surprised now with my perspective? No, you're...
I appreciate it. I appreciate it. You and I
bored with life,
tend to...
aren't you?
I mean, yeah, generally. You and I tend to, it's so funny because you and I tend to like express the same thing in different ways, like slightly different ways.
Yeah. So this idea is, we just talked about this earlier in the episode, which is that the idea that you, the listener, will attain enlightenment, who is it that's attaining that? That's the question here. The person you think you are, the self that you think you are, is a construct. It's a house of cards. It doesn't really have a solid ground. It's built upon multiple other factors. It's codependent, if you will. There's a term called codependent arising in Buddhism, which is that phenomenon exist and they rise in the field of awareness momentarily, but they do so entirely dependent on many other factors. So they don't exist independent of themselves or of others. And so who you are as a self being fabricated to begin with doesn't actually get enlightenment. And yet the word and the experiences that these mystics have, that these great masters have, is pointing to something. There's some fundamental phenomenon that's happening with masters of multiple traditions who wake up and realize something about reality. And so we use the term enlightenment to point to that, even though we know that the word itself never quite captures what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I've heard, people are become enlightened or whatever, but I feel like not even about the people who do or don't become enlightened now that we're having this conversation, but for me, it's been more like you are enlightenment, like if there's no self and there's just this non-dual, I can't even call it a field, but this non-dual fullness, like you are enlightenment. Everything that you are is already not just enlightened, but it's enlightenment itself. It's the very fullness of what is.
Good way of putting it. The fullness of what is. That's the title of your book, Stephen.
I'm not writing a book.
If you ever wanted to.
I don't want to.
Jumping into much more important things.
Have you ever done improv, Adam?
Uh-huh.
You know how one of the fundamental tenets of improv is yes and?
Yes and.
Like you always continue on, like the person's idea. I feel like I've just inadvertently become the no.
No
crowd.
but.
Like no.
You're the no
not even
but.
a but. Not even just a no. Not even just but. Just like no. Like Adam's really like ramping up here, and just like Stephen just kills the vibe.
For the listeners, I text him sometimes, and have every now and then, and
yeah, we talk like once a month.
It's like a casual conversation, very simple question, like, oh hey, I don't even know. It's something casual, like, would you want to go hang out or whatever? And he responds, never, or no, like just flat out, completely derailing any potential for a normal human conversation via text. But that's Stephen for you.
I'm a real charmer.
It certainly is. Okay, so Hakuin, just gonna wrap up his life here as we wrap up the episode.
We're doing a book here, yeah.
This guy, I just love his character. His student, he has like a disciple who ends up writing his biography. His name is Torei, and Torei is actually a clean-cut, straight-laced kind of guy. Doesn't do drugs, doesn't drink. He goes by the book, and there's this great quote here about how he walks in to see his master like smoking. I just found it so cute. Torei, a priest who was known for his strict adherence to the precepts, writes how he would sometimes enter Hakuin's chambers and catch the master hastily concealing his still smoking pipe behind his back. It's so cute. I just think that I just had this image of like this massive giant of a master who was told to be one of the greatest Zen masters in the country at that time, and his student comes in and he's like, "Oh shit, gotta hide my pipe." Just love it.
Well, I think getting back to Hakuin instead of goat videos. Really, he was a monument of a figure in Zen, and that came about not only because he was so loud, he's a very loud person, but he was clearly an enlightened master, and he clearly had something to teach people. And so I think it was that combination of being a very loud opponent of the status quo, while at the same time having something genuine to offer students who came to him. Because just like any of us who are, if you've ever heard, working in a group that, when one person thinks something, there's bound to be another person who thinks the same thing. So Hakuin's disillusionment with quote unquote do nothing Zenists was he's not the only one who felt that way. And so when people heard what he was saying, when people heard his voice, they were inspired to hear what he had to say as an alternative, and he had a lot to say. He was a extremely prolific master in his teachings, and then his, it talks about in the beginning of the book how the fact that he had an autobiography at all was very rare. Most Zen priests were notoriously silent on their lives and the details of it. And he was a writer, he was an artist, he really shared himself and his inner world with others.
There are two quotes here. I don't think we've quoted enough.
That's true. We haven't.
One's a short one, which is again his biographer / disciple Torei, who describes him as having, quote, the heavy, deliberate motions of an ox and the penetrating glare of a ferocious tiger. That was Hakuin. The next quote describes how he practiced with his students. And I don't think this would fly nowadays, but it kind of gives you a sense of how he trained and disciplined his students in the dojos. This is kind of a longer quote, so Stephen, get ready.
I got my pillow here.
Okay, good. Students gladly endured the poisonous slobber the master spewed at them. They welcomed the stinging blows from his stick. The thought of leaving never even entered their minds. Some stayed for 10, even 20 years, totally indifferent to the possibility they might have to lay down their lives at Shoinji and become dust under the temple pines. Hunger awaited them in the morning. Freezing cold lurked for them at night. They sustained themselves on greens and wheat chaff. Their ears were assaulted by the master's deafening shouts and abuse. Their bones were hammered by furious blows from his fists and stick. What they saw furrowed their foreheads in disbelief. What they heard bathed their bodies in cold sweat. When they first arrived at Shoinji, they possessed the beauty of a Sung Yu or a Ho Yen, probably Chinese masters, I'm sure. Their complexions glowing with radiant health, but before long, they were as thin and haggard as a tufu or chia tao, their pallid skin drawn taut over their bony cheeks. Would a single one of these monks have remained at Shoinji even a moment if he had not been totally dedicated to his quest, grudging neither his health nor life itself?
Wow. It's so interesting. Like, obviously that wouldn't fly today.
Fists and
Although
sticks.
people try. But I think it's so interesting how there's, to a much lesser extent, when you find a teacher who you really feel has your back, you'll go through a lot to learn from them. You'll go through a lot. And a lot of what you go through ends up being kind of the point too, but it's just amazing. I think that speaks volumes to what he was able to impart to these students, Not that I'm, necessarily want everyone to go and get the shit beaten out of them by a Zen master, but like it speaks to something that they were sticking around.
Yeah. I also like how dedicated they were. I mean, if they really are willing to suffer hunger and pain and, the physical trials that they went through, what are they? This is a question for like the modern Western man or woman. Clearly they were striving for something and that they were willing to go through all that for. And for them, this idea of a spiritual awakening was very, very real and something that they would spend 10, 20 years enduring and suffering to have a glimpse of. That is really compelling for me. And I feel in the Western world, it's so not prevalent. In the Eastern world, it is, and India, China, Japan, Korea, it's very much a part of their mythos and their culture. It's dying now because of Western influence, but that's something that I think is missing in our culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in general, I've practitioners who want to be, they have a teacher, they're found a path that they like, but they don't really want to give up anything. Like they don't want to really be wrong. They're really attached to their identities as being right, and I feel like this is why it's so hard to be a teacher, is because you're basically taking everything away from this person, and not necessarily. I don't mean taking away like violently or like Hakuin's style of berating people, etc. But like fundamentally, as someone who's trying to enlighten someone, you have to remove illusion, right? And that tends to rub people the wrong way. And I think it speaks to the patience and perseverance of these masters who deal with trying to genuinely help people attain enlightenment, and who are just constantly told that they're being too harsh or too wrong, that they're wrong, or that I wouldn't explain it that way, or like you need to do this differently. And
yeah, there's something about the world's PC environment now that limits that.
I don't even get into the PC-ness of it, because it's not even that it's. I mean, you could say that that's a part of it, but it's not even like PC. It's just like no one's really willing to be vulnerable. It's not like someone said something offensive. It's like, I'm not really to offer this person my whole being, like bare and naked.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not willing to let this person really see me. And it's a defensive mechanism to protect ourselves, to lash out instead. And that's why, when you like bow to a teacher or anything, I don't know where I got it. probably from like Kali in the in the Hindu tradition. But whenever I'm bowing, like I feel like I'm offering my head to someone. Like if the teacher wants to take the head, they can take the head. Like it's theirs in that moment. Like I'm giving them that to them. In practice, I'm as terrified as everyone else. But I've always had that image in my mind, and maybe that's why I like weird stuff like that. But
Right. No, that makes sense. I immediately think of
charnel grounds.
Charnel grounds. Yeah, I immediately think of in Japan and Korea and China the tendency to bow to another rather than shake hands, right? And then my mind also goes to the Islamic tradition, which is when you pray, you actually bow all the way down and your head touches the ground and exposing the nape of your neck, which is a very vulnerable position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we even talked about that in an earlier episode, but I've always just had the image of like really surrendering your head to someone, like to the teacher. Like there's a bit of intention there when I do it. It's not just like, oh, I'm bowing respectfully. It's like, no, you're the teacher. You can take whatever you want.
Wow.
In practice, I fight tooth and nail just like everyone else, but that's the imagery in my head.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's great. I feel pretty happy in that we were able to sort of express Hakuin and the power of his life and the revolution that he brought about.
Yeah, absolutely. He's why Rinzai Zen is still around, that's for sure.
If you're listening, type in Hakuin Zen on Google, and there's a bunch of his calligraphy artwork. You can get a sense of his personality in his artwork. You'll see
absolutely.
brush paintings, brushwork with ink and canvas, but there's sort of like a controlled chaos, and his use of space is so it's free and very unencumbered. It seems like it's barely on the verge of being sort of insane and done by a child, but it's clearly done by someone gifted in the arts, and that's another way of getting to know Hakuin on a visceral level.
That's a great suggestion.
Well, on that note, any parting words, dear friend?
I actually don't think so.
I was afraid you were going to do like an awkward silence for. Thank God.
I know you were. I knew as soon as I started being quiet, I was like, Adam's going to freak out. I've got you pegged.
Yes. So, as usual, email us, send us messages with book suggestions.
We love to hear from you.
Yep. letterstothesky.com. We got a Patreon page. We have a Discord. We will always post on Discord what book we're about to record, so you can read along with us. And if you have a series that you'd like us to do, just send us an email. And there's a link for the contact form on our website.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. I'll see you later.
All right, Adam. Well, I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.